Hello and welcome back to the Stronghold. I'm the Magi. That's right, I decided it was time to take an on-screen persona. And it's that time again. It's midweek, and I want you to play some Magic so you can win 2 free rare or better ICRs. This week's midweek Magic is going to shape up to be pretty standard, except for the fact that we're going to talk about what is the best budget deck to run right now in the competitive standard environment. Yep, I'm talking about a budget deck. Before we get into all that, allow me to do the awkward thing and promote the channel. A while back, one of my viewers was kind enough to point out that we are the only channel putting out timely midweek Magic content. So be sure to subscribe right here at the Planeswalker Stronghold for all of your future midweek Magic needs, because we will be bringing you a deck list or strategy every single week. So what do you say we put all this aside and just get to that? Just a few days ago, I promised to bring you the World Championship Mono Blue control deck for this here midweek Magic event, and that is exactly what we're going to do. We are going to talk about the Tier 1 deck that made waves at World's Championship. Get it? Blue, islands, water, made waves. Anyway, I'm not funny, and I know it. This is a deck that you can build for as little as 4 or maybe even less rare wild cards. And today we are going to talk about how to make this deck yours from your existing collection with no wild cards potentially. Results may vary. All right, so let's really take a look at this World Championship deck. Really, as of right now, I'd say this is your ultimate goal for having the perfect version of the deck, as demonstrated by someone more successful at Magic than me, because, well, they were playing a World Championship. What I have done here, though, is kind of broken the deck up into more manageable chunks to think about. Starting on the left-hand side here, all of these are essentially card draw. 4 copies of Consider, 4 copies of Impulse, which is technically not drawing a card, but it is what it is. And Thirst for Discovery, another essential card draw piece. All of these potentially go up in value depending upon what choices you make in the rare slot. More on that to come. From there, we have Disruption and Tempo pieces, 4 copies of Fading Hope to bounce your opponent's stuff back and potentially allow you to scry in the earlier turns, and Slip Out the Back, which not only, well, this card kind of does double duty. It allows you to potentially deal with an opponent threat to buy you that last turn you need to win, or it allows you to protect your own threats from that pesky spot removal stuff going on, or even non-spot removal. Those board sweepers, if something's phased out, it's unaffected. From here, we have what are commonly referred to as soft counters. That being, it counters the spell unless an opponent, yada yada yada, in this case pays more mana, and in both cases it's 2 mana. For 1 blue, you get Spell Pierce, counter target a non-creature spell unless its controller pays 2, and Make Disappear, counter target spell of any kind unless its controller pays 2. That costs you an additional colorless mana, and it gives you that casualty ability that really won't often get used in this deck because you have so few creatures. From here, we have the hard counter suite, and we've got 4 copies of Essence Scatter to counter those creature spells, and then 3 copies of Negate for the non-creature variety of spells. As long as you're saying about 7 on your total hard counters, I'd say that's about the right quantity. Obviously, most decks that you're going to be facing, your creature spells are going to be the dominant ones. Negate, of course, is more useful in the mirror match, where most of the spells your opponent is throwing out are not creature based, because if you notice here, we're about 80% the way through the deck and haven't talked about a single creature. From here, we've got land. It couldn't really be more simple. 21 islands. And if you have a copy of the Kamigawa Legendary Land in blue, Soaring City, certainly run it. And there's definitely some builds out there that are running 2 of these, mostly because the channel ability allows you to do a little bit more disruptive option. And I wouldn't argue with you if you wanted to run 2. From there, of course, though, if you don't have a copy of this, running a 22nd island is not really going to hurt this deck all that much. And of course, once you have completely alienated your opponent by countering and undoing everything it is they're trying to do, you still need a way to win. And this deck has 2 answers to that. The first off being a comment from Dominaria United. If you played any limited in this, I'm sure you saw an awful lot about this. Tolarian Terror, a 7 mana 5/5. And yes, I really did say 7 mana. But this spell cost 1 colorless mana to cast for each instant and sorcery card in your graveyard. Guess what you're doing a lot of? You're putting instants in your graveyard. That's what 80% of the deck is putting instants in your graveyard. So this comes down easily on turn 3, turn 4 at a much reduced cost. Gives you a nice 5/5 beater that is hard for your opponent to deal with because it wards for 2 additional mana. So answers just aren't going to come as quickly. And of course, the all-star of this deck is Haughty Djinn. 3 mana, X4 flyer. Its power is equal to the number of instants and sorcery cards in your graveyard. And as we have previously talked about, that's what you spend a lot of your time in this deck doing, is putting those instants in your graveyard. In addition to that, once you get this onto the field, it makes your instants easier to cast because instants and sorcery spells cost 1 generic mana less to cast. And that's why I don't stress too much about the functional difference between Spell Pierce and Make Disappear, because once I have my Hot Boy in the field, those have the same mana cost. Similarly, Impulse, Thirst for Discovery, those get discounted too. Your entire hard counter suite goes down to a single blue mana. So if you can stick a Haughty Djinn and then protect it, you can pretty much control the game with just 4 or 5 mana. It really gets kind of absurd. Okay, so now that we talked about the baseline deck, let's talk about some of the alternatives that you might want to run if, for some reason, you don't have the individual cards in the best version, or you don't want to spend the wild cards to get them. First thing off, things like Curate makes a nice draw card package, potentially better than Impulse. That's something I plan on drawing or testing, I guess I should say, because it is an actual card draw trigger, which can be important in some versions of the deck. Also, Surveil 2 gives you some card selection. Impulse, of course, allows you to look at the top 4 cards, but then you're only putting 1 in your hand and the others in the bottom of your library, basically gone forever. So if you hit 2, 3, or God forbid 4 really good cards, you can do as much harm as good with that. Also, Stern Lesson, draw 2 cards, then discard a card, create a tapped Power Stone, is a reasonable alternative over spending wild cards for Thirst for Discovery. Stern Lesson, of course, is going to create Power Stone that will do little to nothing for you in this deck. So not as good, but if you really are short on those uncommon wild cards, you don't have all your copies of Thirst for Discovery, this is a reasonable placeholder there. Let's see here. That doesn't really do. I think those are the main cards we're interested in from Dominaria United. Haha, just kidding. There are some other cards to consider from Dominaria United. I just completely left those out. Scatter Ray is a nice soft counter with a very high cost. It's going to be more valuable in the late game than something like Spell Pierce and Make Disappear because of that 4 mana gatekeeping cost. Really, I would consider this a good alternative to either of the Spell Pierce or Make Disappear. From there, we also have Urza's Rebuff. This gives you a nice stall tactic as well as a hard counter. I don't love the casting cost being at 3, but again, once you have Haughty Djinn out, that drops down to 2 and is far more reasonable. And it gives you a lot of versatility. This is a hard counter, and it allows you to tap down creatures, so it plays a dual role of being both a hard counter and a disruptive aspect. Good alternative if you're looking to conserve wildcards on things like Slip Out the Back, for instance. And Desynchronize is another disruption issue, but I think the casting cost is too high for this deck. And yeah, I think that's really it. Flow of Knowledge could be good in this deck. It really could. 5 mana though is a lot. And that's 5 mana that you don't have counters and things like that up. So you would potentially be sacrificing a good chunk of card draw against the ability to protect your beat down creatures. I would watch that. It's probably worth testing, but I'm not sure it's going to be good in this deck, despite this probably being the best deck for this card if it's an option at all. Now, of course, the other recent set that many of you are going to have easy access to is Dominaria United. So let's take a look at some of these cards going on in here. And for those who maybe aren't familiar with Dominaria United, if you're very new to Arena or just coming back from a break, there are a lot of off-color kicker options in here. Like Rona's Vortex is a very good disruptive piece, but it's a little less good without the kicker. Return target creature or planeswalker to its controller's hand. If the spell was kicked, that permanent goes on the bottom of the library instead. So if you don't have your Fading Hopes, or you don't have all your Fading Hopes, obviously Rona's Vortex might be a very good viable option. So is Shore Up. One of the key factors around this deck is sticking one of your beater creatures, Tolarian Terror or Haughty Djinn, and then protecting it with things like Slip Out the Back and counter spells. Shore Up is another viable option. Not only is it a common and in a more accessible set than Slip Out the Back, it's just really cheap. It does so much for you. And if you're able to defend the creature using this, it ends up making it that much stronger through a +1/+1 counter. It also allows your creature to maybe sneakily play some double duty and end up blocking after it's swung, because Shore Up also untaps the creature. The issue here is you can't use this on your opponent's creature to any great effect, the way that you can Slip Out the Back. That is definitely the more versatile option in that regard. From there, of course, Essence Scatter and Impulse are both in our main deck. Impede Momentum is kind of a B-grade option here. It does have a nice stall in much the same way that things like Fading Hope do, but it costs a little bit more. It's sorcery speed. I wouldn't run this unless you just really had to. Also Negate, of course, that's in your main deck list here. That's very, very good. Protect the Negotiators is a soft counter that is dependent on the number of creatures that you control, and unfortunately this deck just doesn't run that many creatures. It does create a token creature, but we're not going to be kicking it for white anytime soon, or that should read at all. So not really a great viable option here. Haughty Scorn, again, this has that somewhat awkward 1/2 blue instant casting cost, and it is discounted if they have cast 2 spells, that being your opponent, and it is a hard counter. I would run it if you have to, but really your negates and your essence scatters are going to be much better. They're cheaper, and they're just as accessible because for the most part you're getting them right here in this same set, at least in the form of well, actually essence scatter and negate, both from here. Phyrexian Espionage is another alternative to Thirst for Knowledge, or potentially a placeholder if you don't have all your impulses or all your considers. The fact that you can't kick it means your opponent doesn't discard and it's only draw 2, but still not terrible for those of you that are looking to avoid burning some wild cards while maybe you continue to build this deck. And Tolarian Geyser, another bounce effect. I really think this is overcosted. If you can kick it, it gains you 3 life, which makes it viable in something like Limited, but for Constructed, I just don't think this is where you want to be for 3 mana in this deck. All right, and lastly, let's take a look at the broader standard environment from last year. There's a few cards here that I kind of want to talk about, some for good, some for bad. Alchemist Retrieval, the fact that this costs significantly more to target your opponent's creature makes it far less viable. But again, if you've got to run this over something like Fading Hope, it is an option, and it does protect your creature for the same cost. Fading Hope, the cleave cost on this does go down if you've got the Haughty Djinn, not terribly bad. An offer you can't refuse. Another hard counter only for non-creatures. This I would stay away from because right now, particularly with this pro-artifact relevant environment, giving your opponent 2 treasure tokens could be really, really bad. And I wouldn't try and use this as an accelerant in this deck. That's just card disadvantage, way too much. Consider, of course, in the main deck, Fading Hope in the main deck. Otherworldly Gaze, Surveil 3. This is just a slightly cheaper version of Impulse, but it has that same problem. You're not technically drawing the card for that trigger. It does, on the other hand, give you a flashback alternative to cast it again, but of course then that removes it from your graveyard, making it a little less ideal, as we have multiple cards that benefit from having things like Instants in the graveyard. So kind of a desperate move and not really where we want to be. The Secret of the Keys is just pretty terrible. Slip Out the Back we've talked about being good. Spell Pierce we've talked about being good. Wash Away, counter target spell. Again, this for 1 mana to counter a spell that wasn't cast from your owner's hand is pretty situational, and the cleave cost is really less than ideal. We've talked about much better alternatives at that casting cost that still aren't necessarily great alternatives. A little chat, look at the top 2 cards. This has the same problem as Impulse. It's more expensive and harder to come by for many of you. Disdainful Stroke is far too situational, as it can only target a mana value of 4 or greater, although depending upon what the meta does with all these big monstrously huge spells and artifact creatures, this could become more of an option. But also Streets of New Capenna is not a hugely accessible set for many of us. Disruption Protocol is really only good if you are running artifacts, and we are not. Essence Capture is a viable alternative to Essence Scatter. It is more expensive at uncommon. It does give you the +1/+1 counter on your creature, but again, like if you don't have your creature, that didn't do anything as an added benefit. And the double blue casting cost is actually much higher in this deck, because again, Haughty Djinn is going to reduce the cost of many of our things like Make Disappear, Essence Scatter, and Negate. Geist Wave, it's just an overcosted bounce spell. Really, you've got multiple copies of Fading Hope. We've talked about better alternatives on this. Just stick with those. Lunar Rejection, Make Disappear, we've talked about being good. Planar Incision, again, another exile effect. It's kind of a bounce. It could be used as an alternative to slip out the back. K&D, Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, is definitely a more accessible set than Streets of New Capenna. This can be used to protect your own creature or take your creature out of, or your opponent's creature out of that crucial combat if need be. I would consider this a viable alternative, although it is a little bit more expensive, but worth considering. Ambush is terrible, Startle pretty terrible. Is there anything else here that we really need to talk about? Geistlight Snare is good in applications outside of Standard, where spirits are more relevant. What else have we got going on here? Siphoned Essence isn't bad. It's a little overcosted. The blood token isn't going to be relevant for you. Thirst for Discovery, we have talked about. Thirst for Knowledge would be awesome if we cared about artifacts, but we don't. Witness the Future is pretty good. Case the Joint is a little overcosted compared to Thirst for Discovery. Yeah, all of this is really getting beyond where we want to be in casting cost. The other one is Syncopate. As a soft counter, this is a good option against maybe spending wild cards on Spell Pierce and Make Disappear. But I would say if that's really the option that you're making, either of these are worth the wild cards and add more value than something like Syncopate to your deck. But if you're just really looking to get this deck done today and get some play in, and you feel confident you're going to end up with these or ultimately not wanting them, that is a nice filler card there. All right, and let's wrap up the flexibility discussion on this deck by dealing with our creature package here, as small as it is. Tolarian Terror is a common from a recent set. There's really no reason to not have these in your collection unless you really just started. It's fairly irreplaceable. I would say you'll end up with this fairly quickly if you don't have it already. But if you don't have them right now and you've got good versions of the other 56 cards in this deck, it's probably worth the wild cards to just go ahead and snatch these up. And that's not something I say very often. Haughty Djinn, our 3-mana X4 flyer, is really the heart and soul of this deck. He cares about the instants and sorceries, which is what we have built all of this around. He makes those easier for you to cast. Really, for rare wildcards on this would not be a lot to ask for a tier 1 competitive deck, particularly if you have good answers for, again, the other 56 cards in this deck already. 4 wildcards is not that bad. You can certainly do this without wildcards. Of course, you can always get lucky in your opening your packs and having drafted, easily pick up a copy there. Haughty Djinn is also featured in one of the predominant jump-in packs. I can't remember exactly which one it is off the top of my head. So check out my jump-in tier list video that was recently updated for Brothers of War to know exactly which pack that is. Similarly, Ledger Shredder is also in another jump-in pack that you can learn more about in the previously mentioned other video. And while it's not nearly as strong as Haughty Djinn and not a long-term answer, you could certainly use copies of Ledger Shredder in place temporarily for copies of Haughty Djinn. Now let's say you don't have any of those options and you don't want to spend the wild cards for Tolarian Terror. There are still some other things going on here. The first of which I am not seeing. Where are my Delvers? Haha, just kidding. What? Oh, because I have it filtered to rares. Haha, that'll do it. So yeah, Delver of Secrets. Here we go. A 1/1. It flips and becomes a 3/2 evasive if you can show a instant or sorcery off the top of your deck just before your draw phase. Pretty good. It is a viable option for this as a replacement. Honestly, though, list running Delver of Secrets are not as good as just the straight up Haughty Djinn Tolarian Terror. So this is not the best option I would be considering. Again, we talked about Ledger Shredder, and this is really one of the reasons why I talked several times in this video about getting a legitimate draw here. Well, actually, no. This is off your second spell, and of course that triggers each turn. That's good stuff. The reason why you might want to consider draw is here we go. Fairy Vandal. This is kind of a tier 2 alternative to some of your creature packages. A 1/2 evasive flyer with flash, so it counts as a spell potentially that cast on your opponent's turn and allows you to play a creature while still holding up your counter magic and protections and things like that, and then not wasting your mana right at the end of the turn. But this is, in fact, the main reason I talked about your draw triggers as opposed to just putting cards in your hand, because of course Fairy Vandal gets bigger every time you draw a card, and that makes it a good long-term threat. It is an uncommon. You might already have these in your collection, but Streets of New Capenna is not a great set for us to be drafting at this point. More on that in many other videos. But again, if you have them, you don't have the wild card for something like Haughty Djinn. You don't have your Ledger Shredders to put in there. It's another viable option to finish out this package on the short term. Another that I think is, again, not quite as good as Storm Chaser Drake. These are only affected or get better by cards that target it, and most of your stuff isn't going to target it unless it's trying to save it. So not great. I would try and avoid that if at all possible.
All right, and final thoughts, super secret tech for those of you who actually stayed and watched the video instead of just copying the deck list and importing it into Arena and starting the event. That's right, we've got super secret tech just for you, because the biggest threat this deck is going to see in today's meta is the mirror match. And there's one simple thing I want you to remember when you face off in a mirror match with this deck. That is, he who moves first is gonna lose. Basically what you want to do is wait for your opponent to play or try and stick their Haughty Djinn first. And when they do, they're gonna tap out some of their mana, use some of their cards in their hand, leaving you in a good position to win that counter war. So what you want to do then is counter out that exchange, make their Haughty Djinn fail, and then next turn you untap and play your own Haughty Djinn. At that point, they have even less cards in their hand, they are probably tapped out, and they have no choice but to let your Haughty Djinn resolve. From that point forward, you just continue to protect that Haughty Djinn until you win the game. It's really that simple, folks. Now, get out there and get those 2 free rare or better ICRs. What's that? You didn't catch all that? Well, Matt would like you to know that any deck list applicable to this video can be found down in the doobly-doo. Hey, let's not forget, the whole reason to participate in these totally free midweek Magic events is the prize support is awesome. And don't forget, if this video gets just 10 likes by 8 p.m. tonight on the day of release, I will be live playing this on my Twitch channel. And with all that having been said, don't forget, smash that like button like Ronnie J would. And until next time, I'll see you in the arena.